All right, your book always opens up every chapter with an opening vignette, and it's going to be about something, they go into more detail, and believe me, folk, there's a lot more detail that can be said. In fact, we could take an entire course and just talk about the Massachusetts colony and spend the entire semester talking about the Massachusetts colony. But this is a survey course, but they go into a little bit more detail about one event. Roger Williams founded Rhode Island. He was banished from the Massachusetts colony, and because he disagreed with the government, so they banished him. Again, folk, the sheer lack of tolerance, the sheer lack for dissenting viewpoints. Most of you, when you hear the issues that separated Roger Williams from the rest of them, would probably agree with Roger Williams. At least he did have, or should have had the right to speak out. But the Puritan colony did not tolerate dissent. As a result, people like Roger Williams, Thomas Hooker, and Hutchinson were banished. We'll talk about all three of them in this chapter. Northern colonies. Northern colonies, we're talking about mostly Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. We'll eventually, though, get to New York and Pennsylvania. The first settlers in Massachusetts were mostly Puritans. Now, by Puritan, the Puritans contended that the break from the Catholic Church was not far enough. They wanted to get rid of more Catholic practices from that were still left in the Church of England. By backing up a little bit, Henry VIII set himself up as head of the Church of England. He started the Church of England. Now today we call it the Episcopal Church, for those of you who might not know. Anyway, the Church of England was started by Henry VIII. He took lands from the Catholic Church and he began to persecute the Catholics. I will say this though, not all of England converted to his church. A high percentage of people remained Catholic. And this was eventually to lead to religious tolerance because the Protestants saw that they could not. Never seen that before.
That's pretty crazy.
Huh?
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, well, the alert system. Anyway, I acknowledge I received the alert, so whatever. All right. Anyway, a lot of persons wanted to go back to the Catholic Church. A lot of them didn't. A lot of people in England wanted to follow the teachings of two Protestant reformers, Martin Luther and John Calvin. John Calvin's ideas caught on more in Scotland than Martin Luther's. Now, make a long story short, I touched on this, and of course this is not a European history course, so I'm not going to go into much detail about what was going on, but essentially Martin Luther disagreed with a lot of the practices of the Catholic Church, and he could not get the Pope of that day to agree with him, so he broke away and started his own church. Lutheranism took over a lot of Germany and took over Scandinavia, that is Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. And these churches are still strong in these countries, the Lutheran Church. Calvin started out in Switzerland. Well, after Henry VIII died, under his successors, England was to go back and forth, tottering between Catholicism and Protestantism. Two kings in particular, James I, not James I, James II, and Mary, Bloody Mary, she was a queen. But anyway, two monarchs in particular tried hard to get England back in the Catholic Church. Bloody Mary was a daughter of Henry VIII. She did not get the throne right away. When Henry VIII died, he bypassed his two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, and gave the throne to his son. His son was weak and sickly and only lasted 6 years and never really grew up, died at the age of 16. So then they had Lady Jane Grey, who lasted 9 days. Then Mary took over. She tried hard to reverse England's trend toward Protestantism and bringing it to the Catholic Church. She killed 300 Protestants, but by the end of her reign, England was more Protestant than ever. So, when Mary died without any children, she tried hard to have children. Today's doctors, some of them believe they could have fixed what her problem was from what they described at the time. Some doctors think they know what was wrong with her. Anyway, she could not have children. So when she died, her half-sister Elizabeth took the throne. Now, at heart, Elizabeth was a Catholic. But the Pope of her day said she was illegitimate, and I've seen in Catholic literature to this day the Catholics say she was illegitimate for two reasons. Number one, the Catholic Church never sanctioned her father's marriage to her mother. And number two, she was obviously conceived while her father was still married to his first wife. I mean, you may know Henry VIII had 6 wives. And Bloody Mary came from the first wife. Elizabeth came from the second wife. Anyway, Elizabeth, though, was forced into the Protestant church because the Protestants had recognized her father's marriage to her mother, so she had to become a Protestant in order to get the throne. But, to her credit, she generally persecuted neither side. And during her long reign that spanned some 4 decades, Catholic and Protestant learned that they could get along with each other in some kind of harmony. The Protestants decided, let the Catholics be Catholic, and the Catholics decided, let the Protestants be Protestant. We'll try to get along. So they got along for a time. Elizabeth tried to avoid the extremes because Protestantism was taking on some extreme viewpoints. Anyway, she died. James I and his son Charles I started to try to avoid the extremes of Protestantism. Now, both of these kings, James and Charles, were officially Protestant, but they persecuted the Puritans. All right, eventually, Charles I took over. Parliament was mostly Puritan. Charles I dissolved Parliament. And this leads to the story of the Massachusetts colony. A Puritan colony settled there in 1620. We know of them as the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were a branch of extreme Puritans called Separatists. They said, we can't reform the Church of England. It's got the king on their side. We want to form a completely new church, completely separate from both Catholic and Anglican practices. So the Puritan colony wound up going to Holland, where they had religious freedom, but they felt miserable there. In Holland, their children started learning Dutch. Their children started playing with the Dutch children, picking up Dutch and coming home and speaking Dutch. And their parents didn't like it. They were forgetting English, because all they heard every time they went outside was Dutch and more Dutch. In addition, the Dutch wore bright colored clothes, and the Puritans believed in drab, dark colored clothes. Keep that in mind later, because it's going to become important to the story later. But these separatists finally decided we're just miserable here in Holland. Then they heard about the New World and they said, let's go to Virginia. So they set sail for Virginia, but a big storm came up. In those days, they didn't have satellites overhead to tell where the storms were. And a hurricane would come up without any warning, and all of a sudden, wham, there you were within a matter of an hour or two in the middle of a hurricane you couldn't get out of. Many a ship was lost in one of these, but anyway, a big storm came up and blew the ship all the way from the course in Virginia up to Massachusetts. It wound up Massachusetts, but because there were a few people on board who were not Puritans, they had to sign the Mayflower Compact. The big ship they went on was the Mayflower. They signed the Mayflower Compact, which guaranteed religious freedom for all. The Mayflower Compact is a valuable document, even though the Puritans didn't always abide by it. Anyway, the date was 1620, some 13 years after the Massachusetts colony started. The colony almost perished Again, these people knew nothing about farming in the New World. And finally, a couple of Indians came into the colony, Samoset and Squanto by name. These Indians had learned English from having been captured and taken on board a ship. Now, I've already mentioned how that most Indians living in Massachusetts had died of some disease. We don't know what, but likely it was smallpox and typhus, and maybe measles also, but some disease struck the Indians until they were very few in number. They did not try to wipe out the white man yet. Now, later they did try, but they waited too long. Anyway, these two Indians came in, taught the Puritans how to farm. There was another reason the Puritan colonists did not do well. John Winthrop was sent up as governor. All right, folk, he didn't know any better. He said, all right, let's all of us farm this big plot of land right here. They all would get up and get out and supposedly work. It did not work. The crop had a very poor yield, and many people died. The next year, the governor, John Winthrop, said, all right, I'm going to give each family a plot of land. You take this plot here, and you take this plot here. Everybody plotted their own land. He said he would see women get up who were too sick to work, women who were so sick you wouldn't ask for. They would get up and volunteer and work. They had an abundant harvest that year. Gave the country its first lesson on socialism. The collective farm idea didn't work, but anyway, they had an abundant harvest. He said there were some families who produced more than others, but the ones who had more than they needed willingly gave to the ones who had less. So that November, they had a big feast, a big harvest. This was to lead to the first Thanksgiving. And every fourth Thursday, Thanksgiving Day used to occur November 25th, but Roosevelt changed it. Franklin Roosevelt, because he wanted to improve the economy, and he thought if Thanksgiving would occur on Thursday and everybody had Friday off, then they would be more likely to go on a big shopping spree to start the Christmas season. So today's Thanksgiving always begins on Thursday, the fourth Thursday of every month. Some Christmas seasons are shorter than others. Christmas season can begin on November 23rd and November 29th, depending on when Thanksgiving occurs. All right. John Winthrop said that his colony would be a city on a hill or a light of the world. He said, I believe that we can build for ourselves a colony that all the world will marvel. This is one thing that the Puritans had that the United States still has today. Most people in the United States believe the United States is the best country in the world, and they try to make other countries like us. They say democracy is the best form of government there is. That's questionable, but if democracy will work for everybody or not. But anyway, we believe that our way of living, our thought processes, our Constitution is the best there is. So this is the one thing that the Puritans and the present day Americans have in common. We'll be an example of the whole world. We'll be the city on a hill, the light for the world. At first, very few Puritan settlers came in, but then in 1630, Puritans poured in from in droves. Most of the time, they came in as families. Unlike the Jamestown colony, where they came in as single men, and mostly couldn't find wives because there weren't enough women to go around. In the case of the Puritans, they came with their wives, their sons, and their daughters, and basically started life all over again from where they left off in Europe. In fact, women actually made up the majority of the Puritan colony. They came with their husbands, but oftentimes their husbands would get killed or die young, working really hard. More than one case where a tree fell on a man while he was cutting the tree down with an axe. Very dangerous thing to do. These trees are not quite predictable as to how they fall. But today we have better methods. We have the chainsaw, which they didn't have. a chainsaw can better control which way a tree falls. Now, if any of you know more about this than I do, yes, I've cut down a very few trees in my time, and to me it's very scary. Any of you who've done it. Anyway, preachers would oftentimes bring their entire congregation. A preacher in England would get up in one day and say, hey, I've decided that we should go to America. How many of you want to come along? And believe it or not, most of the people would volunteer. They'd charter a ship, load up on a ship, and head for Massachusetts. In Virginia, most of the people who came to Virginia came for economic reasons. In the case of Massachusetts, it was mostly for religious reasons. Now, persons have argued this. Some historians will say that actually the big motivator was economics, and point out how that these people quickly got to work making a living. Well, yes, they did. Except for the first year, they did not have the same kind of starving time that the Virginia colony had. Also, the climate. Massachusetts winters were long and cold. This destroyed a lot of the mosquitoes and disease-causing germs. The people who moved to Massachusetts tended to live a whole lot longer than the people who lived in Virginia. In addition, the young men in Massachusetts could easily find wives, since there were more women than men. And if a man lost his wife, say in childbirth, his preacher would usually quickly find him another wife for him, because the preacher would got around from one village to another more so than other members of the colony did. So the preacher would know of a single woman in another colony who was available, and so they married and they started having 8, 10, 12, and 14 children. Needless to say, the colony grew very, very fast. Unlike the Virginia colony, whether if a man married at all, he might not marry till he was in his mid to late 30s, and then have maybe a child or two before he died. So more people began coming into the northern colony than they did for the Virginia colony, and right away, the North, even though it started later, had a bigger population. This is going to become very important during the Civil War. Maybe you know, maybe you don't know, the North had a lot more people in 1861 when the war started than the South did. And this contributed very heavily to the Southern people's defeat. So again, but it started in the 1600s. The Puritans followed the teachings of John Calvin, who believed in predestination. They believed also in separation of church from state. They did not want secular authorities interfering with the church. Now, I say that tongue-in-cheek. If you were to talk to any Puritan, he'd say, oh, we do not believe in union of church and state. And they oftentimes criticize other people. You unite church and state, but we don't. In actual reality, they united church and state more than probably any other Christian group, and that the church strongly influenced the state. But officially, they would tell you, oh yeah, we separate church from state. No, you join church and state more than any other Christian group around. But you couldn't tell them that. The government passed laws enforcing Christian behavior. Now, I've got to elaborate on this a little bit, folk. Neither Jesus nor any of the disciples ever went to a secular authority and asked the secular authorities to pass laws enforcing Christian behavior. Never did. As far as we have record, none of the disciples ever did. The idea that the state was to pass laws enforcing Christian behavior came during the Middle Ages. It did not come from Christ or the apostles or even the apostolic fathers. It came during the Middle Ages when church and state became united, or closely united, when Christianity more or less took over. Land was distributed almost evenly. This began with Governor Winthrop, who gave a plot of land to each family, and each family's plot was almost the same size. So land was distributed evenly. Okay, generally, a typical New England village, they had a common area called the Green. And if you visit Army bases, sometimes they still have this common area called the Green, where they have their parades and their marches and whatever. You go to the area. And then the houses then were located around the Green. Etc., etc. A bunch of houses. Then the farms were in their backyard. They'd farm in their backyards. Again, each of them claimed to plot lands, but the Green was there in common where they might hold meetings or whatever, or graze their cattle or their horses. That was all done on the Green. The first battle of the Revolutionary War occurred on Lexington Green. Big, wide open area. But New Englanders watched out for each other. It was said the New Englanders made sure that their neighbors were not having fun. They kept an eye on each other to make sure that there was no card playing in their neighbor's house, or no puppet shows in the neighbor's house. All this was frowned on and outlawed. You might ask, what's wrong with card playing? Well, some people believe it's addictive, and maybe it is. But
well, what's wrong with puppet shows?
I do it myself. What's that?
Yeah. Well, what's wrong with puppet shows?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that. In my way of thinking, nothing. I mean, I go to movies, I take my children to them. Now, lately I haven't been to one, I just don't have time for them. Even though I'm a retired locking employee, I just don't find the time to sit for 4 hours. But here's the big beef. The personal lives of most of your actors and actresses all down through the ages have left a lot to be desired. And a lot of times your actors and actresses cannot separate what they do on the stage or on the set from the real world. And they wind up being loused up in their minds. The person who killed Abraham Lincoln, anybody know what profession he was? He was an actor. Good, several of you knew that. And again, you study the Hollywood, with a few exceptions. Most of them have lives that are extremely lousy, and this has been true all the way down through the ages. And this has given ammunition to people who believe that acting and theatrics is wrong because it takes you away from the real world into a world that doesn't exist, into a dream world. Now again, this is not me. I'm answering your question as best as I understand it. I've been asked it before. But it's a good question. I'm glad you asked it. But they also believed that doing things like this was not good. The word I want to use is holiness. In other words, not in keeping with the holiness of God. Oliver Cromwell was hard against puppet shows and against acting. Now, this is going to wind up lousing him up in a little bit, which I'm going to come to another part of the story, where this is going to wind up lousing him up. So I believe they were wrong. Nevertheless, I must teach what they thought, and you have to at least temporarily take on their mindset that acting and theatrics is against the will of God. I mean, that's their view now, not mine. Now, when Martin Luther made this mistake also, so did the Puritans. They believed that if everybody studied the Bible for himself, they would come to the same conclusion. You can get 10 persons studying the Bible and come to, believe it or not, 11 or 12 different opinions. I mean, yes, as to what's right or wrong. I had a Muslim girl in my class, and when she was outspoken Muslim, well, what if a big Muslim community would become Christian all of a sudden? I said, well, you'd have a problem. And then one of you would start believing you should worship Mary. Another group would say, oh, no, we mustn't do that. One group would believe that it's wrong to take aspirin. Another group would say, oh, no, aspirin was given to us by God as a relief for pain. And one group would say it's okay to smoke marijuana. Another group would say, oh, no, that's wrong. You'd wind up with all kinds of different opinions, and they'd squabble with each other. Eventually, what Protestant Christianity learned to do was just simply say, you go to your church, you go to yours, you don't go anywhere at all if you don't want to. And you unite yourself with believers who believe as you do. But that was to come later. At this time, there was only one functioning church, the Puritan. Now, I want to tell you something I haven't told in very many classes. There are no Puritans today. They changed their name to Congregational, owing to the fact that they're somewhat ashamed of their beginnings. So today, we have at least one Congregational church somewhere in Metro Atlanta, so I've heard, but they do not subscribe to the extreme views of their ancestors. Now, Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson was the daughter of a preacher, but since he worked as a preacher, he had time to teach his daughter Anne to read. Most of the women in her day could neither read nor write. She learned to read and write. Anne Hutchinson's father got into some trouble for preaching doctrines that the government did not like. Yes, I said government. The government was largely controlled by the church. He was told to either quit preaching or change the way you preach. He thought it over, then he humbled himself back down and started preaching the way he was supposed to. This was very humiliating for him because he had to preach what he didn't believe. Anne grew up seeing her father just shrivel up and kind of pine away. Anyway, she grew up, she married. After she married, she met a preacher named John Cotton. John Cotton, like Anne's father, preached against the church, but unlike Anne's father, John Cotton sailed to the New World. All right. Well, in the meantime, Anne had several children. Her oldest son sailed to the New World also. And after a few years, she decided to go to the New World herself. So there in the Massachusetts colony, she met John Cotton again, and John Cotton warned her, now you think you can have freedom here, it's even less free here than it was back in England. Well, now, folk, she began, this is something that personally I would not do. She built her house next to the governor's. She was to do the same thing later when she got banished. But she put her house next to the governor's. Then she started holding meetings in her home to discuss John Cotton's sermons. She developed a doctrine that if you were a member of the elect, in other words, now, this was part of John Calvin's predestination. You had no control over your salvation. God chose, and God alone chose whether you were saved or not. If you were saved from the foundation of the world, you probably were interested in church and singing hymns and reading the Bible. If you were interested in things like card playing or basically leading a sinful life, you were probably not part of the elect. Now, again, folks, understand, this is not me. This is them. All right, anyway, she developed a doctrine that was close to antinomianism, that any action of a person of the elect would not be a sin. So the elect could commit any action he wanted to, and it was not a sin. She didn't quite find these teachers in John Cotton's teaching, but it was close. The idea that salvation was by election alone, whereas Martin Luther said it was by faith alone, she said by election alone. And therefore the elect, no matter what they did, they could not sin, because God himself determined what was sin or was not. Eventually, men started attending her. At first, only women attended. Then men started attending. The governor became alarmed. The governor called her to court. There in court, she did not have an attorney to defend her. She was found guilty of the crime of heresy, and she was banished from the colony. So she and her husband went down to Rhode Island, where Roger Williams had already banished. And yes, she's put her house next to the governor's again. She fell out with the governor and got him unelected. All right, fine and dandy. Except the new governor fell out with the electorate, so the old governor got re-elected, and then the old governor who got re-elected banished her to Long Island. By this time, her husband had died, and only one of her children was left, a 10-year-old. The Indians on Long Island rose up and killed her and her 10-year-old daughter. The white men then rose up and drove all the Indians off Long Island, because after all, they had killed a white person, 2 white persons. We don't know the exact date of her death because her body was not found until several days after the event occurred. Some people thought it was God's punishment to her for her sinful ways. Be that as it may, now again, in today's courts, heresy is not a crime. But supposing that she had actually committed a crime and was accused, if she had been rich, she could have paid for her own attorney. If she were poor, the state was supposed to provide her with an attorney. They didn't. She would have had the right to face her accusers, to defend herself. The jury were to be people who would not know anything about the case. In her case, the 12 jurors who were chosen had already made up their minds that she was guilty. So she really had no chance. Even though she gave some